I don't think it really was a success story. I think this was a kind of media invention. Moldova is fundamentally lacking in capacity. Moldova lacks institutions that are capable of fully understanding what is actually taking place in the country and who the real actors are. Moldova is still a country in which there are very powerful forces in the shadows, and in which also there are openly forces that are completely wedded to Russia. It's still a country that lacks cohesion between different groups, and all of this is used by Russia. The EU, with a different way of thinking and a different policy, yes, in principle, might have the possibility of adopting Moldova and basically presiding over a transformation of Moldova that would strengthen its institutions, that would provide effective integration with the European Union, that would create the incentives and also the barriers that would be required. But this would demand a much riskier, more serious, more determined, a more long-term policy than anyone in the EU is willing to contemplate, unfortunately. So until this changes, Moldova is going to be, I think, in a very vulnerable position. Georgia has a strong civil society, which is very positive. In Georgia as well, there are some very important interests that are supporting Russia through a variety of means, and yet there are also very powerful interests on the other side. And so even staying outside NATO and the EU, I think we could be relatively optimistic about, quite optimistic about Georgia's ability to maintain its independence and its essential integrity, you know, irrespective of the fact that obviously for some period of time in future, Abkhazia and South Ossetia are lost. In Ukraine, there has been a gradual transformation which accelerated with the war. There's been a huge consolidation because the war has consolidated a Ukrainian identity, which did exist before, but it's very, very much stronger now. Even the pro-Russian parties in Ukraine have to pretend that they are not pro-Russian parties.
And in Moldova, Mr. Putin is most popular politician.
Exactly. So this is very different. But Ukraine is the central battleground in Russia's war against the entire post-Cold War Helsinki-based system in Europe. And for Russia, Ukraine is also a vital interest, because Ukraine for Russia, for Russians as well as Ukrainians, is a question of identity. Zbigniew Brzezinski famously said, with Ukraine, Russia remains an empire. Without it is not able to remain an empire. I fundamentally disagree. I think from a Russian perspective, the issue is that without Ukraine, Russia can remain an empire, but it cannot remain Russia. So there's this very strong feeling in Russia, perhaps not as strong as it was 10 years ago, but it's certainly very strong in the Kremlin and very strong on Putin's part, that Ukraine is part of Russia, that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, and that Ukraine's loss will be an enormous blow to the cohesion and integrity of Russia itself. And so this is why I am afraid, even if Ukraine does everything correctly, even if the West's support for Ukraine is more firm than it is now, that Ukraine is going to find itself, maybe for another generation, even if it is succeeding, in a state of hybrid war with Russia, because the stakes are so important on each side.